As with anything, a topic this complex defies a Twitter answer. It defies almost any answer. But I'll simply say a couple of things. I've been in and out of the Middle East for 25 years or so, a lot of time in the last few years. And you have to understand several things that are at work there. And almost no external powers policy with respect to the Middle East has been successful. And in some cases, some of those policies have been spectacular failures. But let's just sort of diagnose what the problem has been. Almost anyone who observes the Middle East today or Middle East crises today will make a mistake if perhaps the first stopping point or the first membrane that they're passing through isn't the Cold War that has emerged between the Saudi-led Sunni nations and the Iranian or Persian-led Shia elements. The weaponization of the differences of the confessions within Islam have created an enormous dynamic in the region, and almost any problem that you find there, if you scratch at it just for a moment, you'll discover that there is some element of that Cold War at work in the process. But that's not it. That's not only it. 100 years after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, which is roughly where we are today, and in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, which revealed for us, I think, in ways that we had not anticipated, structural weakness across the systems of governance of North Africa and the Middle East, the traditional Middle East, and in other areas. What we have found is that there were enormous structural weaknesses in the aftermath of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, because systems of governance never really were put into place in the manner that supported the populations at large. And if you look back at this, almost none of the people in the Middle East would ever have chosen the borders that were imposed on them by outside colonial powers in the aftermath of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the Versailles Treaty and the mandatory period, the period of mandate, where much of the Middle East was turned over to European powers who by the way, couldn't do any better than the Ottomans in controlling the region. They would never have drawn those borders that way. Sykes-Picot comes to mind instantly. They would probably not have selected the leadership that would ultimately be imposed on them by outside powers. And they would probably have chosen other systems of governance that was more consistent with their traditions, their own histories, their tribal relations, their faith, in this case, their particular confession within the faith of Islam. So we had multiple opposing force vectors, if you will, in the aftermath of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the end of World War I, and those continued to simmer, but they were never under any real pressure from within. They might have been pressured from without in the period of the Arab-Israeli wars. But what happened in late December of 2010 and early 2011 was the uprising of the youthful element of one country after another, utterly despairing of any future, either in a dictatorial regime or in an unresponsive tribal regime. And I was at the Central Command at the time when Mohamed Bouazizi in Tunis set fire to himself. It literally threw the match onto the region, and we watched the region burn itself down from one end to the other. And we listened to Al-Qaeda seeking to find justification for their view of Salafi jihadi extremism in what was happening. And frankly, Al-Qaeda tried to sprint out ahead to take credit for this, when in fact this was a massive failure of Arab governance. It was a massive failure of societal support, and it was the human condition which revolted in the region. And it revolted for good reasons that were in many respects local, but in many cases were similar. But it was, and this is a key point, it was really accelerated in ways we've never seen before by social media. and one after another, as groups of young Arabs or Berbers or North Africans across the region saw what was happening in adjacent countries by virtue of Twitter or Instagram or YouTube, it just exploded. So today we have several civil wars, and I won't take you through them because everybody's familiar with the agony. But today we have several civil wars, the Syrian civil war being the most symbolic of how bad this can be, where the preponderance of the population in Syria is displaced. It has destabilized, in many respects, the frontline states, Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, and to some extent Egypt. But now to Strobe's point, because there's a linkage here, the enormous refugee flows into Europe have in fact destabilized European politics as well. This influx of a new quality of individual, and I don't say quality in the context of good, bad, or different, but a different element of society into Europe was responded to often with right-wing politics and nativist politics polarizing the political environment, aided, by the way, by a highly sophisticated Russian influence operation to destabilize confidence in democratic institutions within Europe. And this is where we see the intersection of what's happened in the Middle East with what's happening in Europe today, and how, if we don't get a handle on this, it's only going to get worse. And the most recent conflict in the Middle East, of course, is between Qatar on one side and the so-called quartet on the other, which is Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Bahrain, and Egypt. And on any given day, you can take sides, one side or the other, with the grievances of the two elements. But I think the outcome of this is pretty clear. We're beginning to see some exhaustion creeping into our friends in the region, and America has friends on both sides of the conflict. We're seeing the Qataris perhaps moving more closely into the orbit of Iran, although they're very clearly an Arab state and we have very close relations with them, but that's not an outcome that we want to see. We see the reintroduction of Turkish influence into the region, which is not necessarily something that the Arabs want to see themselves, and the potential for Turkey and Iran to find common interest and common purpose in the Gulf. And I think, worst of all, I think the GCC may be permanently wounded in this process. So what do we do about it? Well, we need in the United States to have a policy. Any policy would be good, but a policy soon which gives our precious friends in the region, which gives our European partners in the region, which gives our allies in the region, which gives them some context then for us to take community action as the community of nations to deal with this. In the end, most of the problems in the Middle East, apart from the weaponization of the confessional differences between Islam, within Islam, are human problems. And the causal factors associated with this is what we have to address. An absence of access to education, an absence of participatory government, an absence of a functioning judiciary, no equal rights for women, and in many cases, zero economic prospects for many of the young men and women of the Middle East. And as a direct result of that, since we can't seem to come together as a community of nations, and certainly most of these nations can't do it for themselves, the long-term effect is a massive, widespread radicalization of tens of millions of young men and women. And that radicalization creates instability within countries, but pushes them into the arms of extremists. And pretty soon they're strapping on suicide vests. So my view would be, we have to swim upstream in this crisis. We have to swim upstream and identify the causal factors that create such distress at the human level, and begin as a community of nations to work with the states in the Middle East to begin to solve these problems. And it's a very complicated issue, and it didn't start last Tuesday, and we're not going to solve it next Tuesday. This is a generational issue. We've got to take some action in the short term at the near horizon to defend ourselves and to keep more states from going over the edge. And then perhaps 10 to 15 years out, in a concerted effort by the community of nations to work within countries to strengthen institutions of governance and finance and education, et cetera, to stabilize the population, and then at the deep horizon, a whole generation out, just constantly be engaged with the countries of the region to stabilize them over the long term, helping them to develop institutions of governance and to provide the kinds of services to the populations that can reduce the radicalization. We're always going to find terrorists. We are always going to find extremists. But we can do something about the causal factors of radicalization. And we'll never solve all of them, but we can certainly get at many of them if we think about this in a systematic way. This is the role that the United States can play.